any tariffs against Canada, we're ready with a response, a purposeful, forceful, but reasonable, immediate response.
The U.S. auto industry is being rocked by Canada's recent counterstrike, which is crippling manufacturers, raising prices, and endangering thousands of jobs. But it gets worse than that. Tesla and the entire electric vehicle industry are in a panic. And if things get worse, your next car might end up costing much more than you anticipate. This isn't just about tariffs. It's a calculated move meant to hit the industry where it hurts the most. Stay with me because this story is far from over, and Canada has one more move to make that could completely change the American economy. When Canada took a daring and unexpected step to retaliate against the most recent round of U.S. tariffs with its own set of economic countermeasures, the world was taken by surprise. Financial markets were rocked by the announcement, and major media outlets rushed to report on it as it happened. Within hours, headlines announced that Canada had added a 10% CK charge to U.S. energy exports and imposed a 25% tariff on American steel and aluminum. Businesses that heavily relied on cross-trade found themselves in crisis mode, forced to reevaluate their pricing, production, and workforce strategies as Washington District of Columbia struggled to regain control of the situation. The question loomed: why had Canada chosen to retaliate now after years of diplomacy and restraint? To understand the answer, we must look at the decades of mounting tensions that led up to this moment. The immediate reaction was chaos, with stock markets plummeting, major corporations scrambling to recalculate their supply chain costs, and American policymakers left in disarray. Tensions have been rising for decades. Even though the United States frequently imposed tariffs on important Canadian industries, such as steel, aluminum, and dairy products, Canada maintained an economic cooperation policy, forcing Canadian businesses to shoulder the financial burden while the Washington District of Columbia pursued policies that gave preference to American industry over its northern neighbor. By imposing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the Trump administration heightened trade tensions, claiming that these actions were required to safeguard American manufacturing jobs. Despite its diplomatic pledges, the Biden administration carried on this pattern by imposing trade restrictions and tariffs that disproportionately affected Canada. Canada was expected to follow policies that hurt its economy without retaliation, which led to a pattern of economic bullying. However, patience has its limits. Instead of letting American policymakers set trade terms without opposition, the most recent round of U.S. tariffs told Canadian leaders that their economy was being treated as expendable. Canada made a decision. Nowhere was the impact felt more than in the U.S. auto industry, which was currently dealing with an unprecedented crisis. This was not merely a reaction. Rather, it was a planned strike intended to strike the U.S., where it hurt the most in its most vulnerable industries. The instant breakdown of the fallout supply chain starts the modern auto industry, which relies on a smooth material supply chain, crossing borders more than once before assembling a vehicle. This fragile system was rocked by Canada's new tariffs on American raw materials, which abruptly resulted in massive cost increases for automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Canadian aluminum and steel, which are necessary for the manufacture of automobiles, are now available. Heavy tariffs made sourcing these materials much more costly for U.S. manufacturers. The additional expenses went beyond production. Each shipment that crossed the border now had a higher price tag, further taxing factories that were already making ends meet. Car prices immediately started to rise, and the effect spread throughout the industry. Auto dealerships braced for consumer backlash, fearing that rising prices would turn off potential customers. Supply chain interruptions resulted in production delays, which in turn led to temporary layoffs at major manufacturing facilities across the U.S. This crisis went far beyond automakers. The retail industry, which relied on efficient supply chains to maintain low inventory costs, faced increasing costs for logistics and transportation. Small companies and farmers who depended on cross-border trade with Canada were prepared for economic uncertainty as tariffs. Wars made it more difficult to forecast expenses and make long-term plans, but perhaps the most disastrous effect was that American consumers would soon bear the full brunt of this trade war, with prices rising for the typical buyer entering a car dealership. Manufacturing towns would experience increased job instability. Everyday goods would progressively become more expensive, and supply chain problems would extend to other industries as the economic shockwaves spread. The Columbian-Washington district was embroiled in a political uproar, and the government was at a loss for solutions. Politicians in Washington are caught off guard. Lawmakers in the Washington District of Columbia went into full-blown panic mode after the announcement from the Canadian government. Political leaders rushed to determine how to handle this sudden escalation, calling emergency meetings. The response was split. Others turned against Trump, claiming that his aggressive trade policies had forced Canada into retaliation. The White House refused, choosing to double down on its stance, with senior officials calling for even higher tariffs on Canadian imports in response. Some blamed Canada, accusing its government of acting recklessly and endangering American jobs. The debate heated up inside Congress. Legislators were urged by business leaders and industry representatives to defuse the trade war before it got out of hand. Some politicians acknowledged the financial risks and pushed for compromise and dialogue, while some advocated for a more robust posture against Canada, claiming that the U.S. could not afford to come across as weak. The American public became more and more irate, and social media was ablaze with conversations about how rising prices were affecting consumers, forcing average families to reevaluate large purchases because of economic uncertainty. Once a cornerstone of the American economy, the auto industry is now at the heart of a developing crisis. The Washington District of Columbia had to decide whether to pursue a diplomatic solution and risk political backlash for seeming to give in to Canada's demands, or to keep intensifying the trade war and possibly harm its own economy even more. This was political warfare, not just economics. By focusing on industries in states with significant political clout, Canada made sure that its tariffs would not be ignored. Pressure was now building on important political figures who couldn't afford to overlook the economic fallout in their states. But the biggest blow came not from orange juice or bourbon, but from Tesla and the electric vehicle sector, where the effects could be disastrous. EV production and Tesla are in crisis. For many years, Tesla has been regarded as the pinnacle of American innovation, spearheading the development of electric vehicles and renewable energy sources. However, the company's success is largely due to a very intricate and delicate supply chain, one that mainly uses resources from Canada. Without access to reasonably priced Canadian metals, Canada's tariffs on nickel, lithium, and aluminum, essential components in the manufacturing of EV batteries, have plunged Tesla into a supply chain nightmare. The immediate repercussions are concerning as Tesla is forced to either find new suppliers, a process that could take years to establish, or pay much higher prices for raw materials, increasing production expenses and reducing profits. Tesla's battery prices will rise, increasing the cost of EVs for customers. Supply chain interruptions might compel Tesla to postpone car deliveries, harming the company's standing at a time when rivals are quickly growing their own EV manufacturing to become the industry leader in electric vehicles. The industry will be rocked by Tesla's troubles, and the crisis affects not just the electric vehicle company, but the whole sector. The U.S. market is currently in jeopardy because automakers like Ford and General Motors, who have both made significant investments in electric vehicle technology, rely on Canadian resources to produce their batteries. The cost of electric cars could increase if these tariffs are maintained. Investors are already responding to skyrockets, slowing down of the switch to clean energy, and giving foreign rivals like China and Europe a significant edge. Following Canada's announcement, market analysts hurried to reevaluate the company's potential profitability, which caused Tesla's stock value to plummet. The consequences go beyond Tesla alone. Every automaker with an interest in EVs must now rework its financial projections and supply chain strategies, because Canada's tariffs make it more difficult to source essential materials. However, this is no longer just Tesla's battle. It has turned into a full-scale political war, with both countries refusing to back down. If shortages of raw materials continue, Tesla's ability to meet production targets could be in jeopardy, shattering consumer confidence in the brand. Once used as a political talking point and a means of mobilizing their supporters and advancing their economic agendas, trade wars are now having unavoidable negative effects on voters, businesses, and entire industries. What started out as a campaign pledge has now evolved into an economic crisis. Layoffs in factories. Tariffs have become one of the most significant election year issues, dividing both major political parties and compelling candidates to support the Republican Party due to rising auto prices and financial instability. This trade war is becoming a political catastrophe. In order to protect American industries and restore manufacturing jobs, President Donald Trump has long supported aggressive tariffs. However, as automakers struggle, supply chains break down, and factory workers lose their jobs, the very people Trump claimed to protect are now suffering from the economic fallout from his policies in crucial swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which were crucial to previous Republican wins. The backlash is intensifying, and some Republican lawmakers are starting to change their positions. Initially, many Republicans supported Trump's trade war, thinking that tariffs would boost American industries. Now, workers are angry and unsure of their futures. However, some Republicans are urging a review of trade policies as the economic fallout deepens. Many corporate executives and business owners who have historically backed the party are angry about increasing expenses and declining earnings. The party is currently divided between those who fear long-term economic harm and those who want to increase tariffs. Democrats, however, disagree sharply about how to respond to the crisis. Some leaders contend that in order to reduce tensions with Canada, diplomatic talks are necessary. Others, however, maintain that in order to stop additional economic harm, trade policy must remain firm. The lack of unity within the party has made it difficult to present a clear alternative to Trump's approach, further confusing voters who are looking for answers as both parties struggle to control the narrative. Progressives believe that the United States should invest in domestic manufacturing and clean energy instead of relying on foreign imports, but moderate Democrats are concerned about appearing weak on trade. One of the most erratic topics of the next election will be tariffs. As economic worries increase, many Americans are losing faith in their government's ability to handle the crisis, despite candidates' desperate attempts to reassure voters. The person who solves the trade with the United States split on tariffs. War might be the key to winning the upcoming election. Canada has never been more united. The rise of nationalism in Canada. Canada is seeing a surge of national unity unlike anything seen in recent years, while the United States is dealing with political turmoil and the economic independence movement is growing. Businesses, government representatives, and the general public have united in their response to the trade war, viewing the tariffs as a direct threat to Canadian sovereignty as well as an economic one. As a result of the growing Canadian movement, customers are choosing to support local companies instead of American ones. Supermarkets and retailers are encouraging consumers to spend their money domestically by promoting Canadian-made goods wherever possible. And grocery stores and restaurants are showcasing domestic alternatives to well-known bringing-in supply chains across Canada, are changing as a result of farmers and manufacturers increasing output to satisfy the rising demand for Canadian goods. Companies that previously depended on American suppliers are now concentrating on domestic alternatives. Recognizing the opportunity, small and mid-size manufacturers are growing their businesses to cover the voids left by reduced U.S. bringing in. In order to encourage businesses to use Canadian-made content on social media more often than American-made content, the Canadian government is also taking action by implementing tax breaks and subsidies. Canadians are urging a long-term move away from the United States and supporting their nation by sharing lists of Canadian substitutes for American brands. Trade dependence, which started as a temporary response to tariffs, is now evolving into a more extensive discussion about economic independence. However, this begs the crucial question of whether this is merely a short-term fix, or if it could portend a long-term change in Canadian economic policies. Some economists caution that Canada still depends significantly on U.S. trade and that breaking off ties would have negative effects. Others contend that this incident serves as a reminder that Canada can support itself without American imports. If the trend continues, it may signal the start of a long-term economic shift that would lessen Canada's reliance on U.S. trade and improve its ties with other international markets. However, even as Canada's economy grows, it still has a significant advantage: the capacity to turn its energy exports into weapons. Nobody anticipated Canada's secret weapon, the energy crisis. The auto industry, steel, and consumer goods have dominated trade war discussions. But one important aspect that has been ignored is energy. The U.S. depends heavily on Canada for its oil, gas, and electricity. And if tensions worsen, Canada could use its energy exports as a strong negotiating chip. The majority of Americans are unaware of how heavily their nation depends on Canadian energy. Every day, millions of barrels of crude oil enter the U.S. from Canada, supplying refineries that power transportation networks and industries. Canada is one of the most significant players in the U.S. energy market because it is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the U.S., accounting for nearly 20% of all U.S. imports. However, if Canada were to restrict or tax these energy exports, the impact would be immediate and severe. Gas prices would skyrocket overnight as refineries scramble to find new sources of crude oil, and major U.S. cities, especially in the Northeast, where Canadian hydroelectric power supports a significant portion. While the U.S. can find steel, aluminum, and auto parts elsewhere, Canada has this as its best negotiating tool. There is no simple way to replace Canadian energy, and if the trade war intensifies further, Canada may retaliate by limiting the export of electricity and gas, plunging the U.S. into a serious energy crisis. The energy trade war has frightened Washington, and some lawmakers are now demanding urgent talks to stop it from getting worse. However, since Canada now has all the power in these talks, it is obvious that if the U.S. keeps pursuing aggressive trade policies, the message will be clear. The United States cannot afford to lose access to Canadian energy, but Canada is not backing down. If the U.S. government is unable to find a solution, the consequences for both economies could be disastrous. But this is no longer just about North America. The entire world is watching how this plays out in Canada. That being said, Canada has the power to strike back where it hurts the most. Countries all over the world are closely observing and evaluating how the U.S. trade war may affect international trade relationships, because it is no longer a regional dispute, but rather a global event with significant ramifications. For instance, China is already looking into new trade agreements with Canada in an effort to guarantee steady access to energy and raw materials. European automakers. The world is changing, and if Washington does not change its policies, the U.S. may find itself isolated in the new economic order. The upcoming months will be crucial because if Canada and the U.S. cannot come to an agreement, this economic standoff could turn into a full-scale crisis. Who will take the next step, and how will it change the future of North American trade? They are shifting their supply chains away from the U.S. and towards Asian and Canadian manufacturers, in recognition of the instability of the North American market. Who wins and who loses the growing trade war between the U.S. and Canada is having a global impact that goes beyond North America and is changing the dynamics of global trade in unexpected ways as the two main partners' economies grow closer. Other countries are filling the voids, and those that have been waiting for a chance to improve their own trade ties with Canada are now acting swiftly to capitalize on the unpredictability between Washington and Ottawa. Critical resources like nickel, lithium, and oil, which Canada once prioritized for U.S. trade, are now at the forefront of talks between Canadian and Chinese officials as a result of China's particularly aggressive efforts to secure long-term agreements with Canada to ensure a steady flow of raw materials. China could significantly benefit economically from these agreements, lessening its reliance on the U.S. while also eroding Washington's influence in international trade talks.